My name's Thomas McEvely, and I'm the chairperson of the Department of Art Criticism and Writing here at SVA, a department that has existed now for 2 years. And at the beginning, 2 years ago, I inaugurated this series of lectures, of evening lectures, which, because the department is different from other departments here, we gave its own name, and we call it the Critics Lecture Series. Now, at first, that seemed appropriate. I think the first speaker that we had in was Arthur Danto. You know, Arthur is a lovable man. He's the art critic that everyone loves to love. He's kind of the Santa Claus of art critics. The room was full, and there were chairs all through there. We went on, and in the first year, we had a number of speakers who were all actually practicing art critics, and whom I wanted to say whatever they wanted to say about where they were coming from as practicing art critics. And now we come to the second year. And in the second year, it just seemed a little inappropriate to me to keep on with the conventional academic art critics talking about what they do and what the ideas behind what they do are. Because for me, you see, the term critic has a broader meaning than that. I think that all human beings are critics. I believe that I have seen members of other species practicing criticism. So in the second year, when I was inviting people to come and talk, I decided to kind of open it up, loosen it up. We had earlier in the year a beautiful, tremendously enjoyable presentation by Carolee Schneemann, who, now Carolee, of course, is not in a conventional academic or professional sense an art critic. She's an artist. But I've always felt, because I've known her for many years, and I've always felt that she had a strong critical intelligence. And I asked her to come and unfold it for us, and she did a fantastic job. And but she was not technically speaking an art critic, so the Critics Lecture Series has begun to drift. I'm no longer insisting that we have conventional academics who have been practicing art criticism for years and who can talk about it. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce this gentleman to you, who I know that right now, when we see Peter Lamborn Wilson, he's sitting at my feet. But I'm not claiming that that's his usual posture in relation to me. I had been aware of Peter for many years before I met him, which was, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. And I had been aware of him in a number of ways. At some point in his, he's a man of many talents. And he's had a fortunate enough life that he's been able to express all these talents and to create products to show the rest of us. And I remember, for example, hearing a fantastically smooth and well-controlled psychedelic radio program that Peter was the main voice on. And I don't know how many of those he did. I heard it late one night in a car driving through the wilderness, and it was a thrill. And as time went on, I began to look for other works by Peter Lamborn Wilson. And it came through to me that he's written a lot of books over the last 30 years or so. I think his list of publications, at least the one that I have, starts in 1975, so that's 30 years. And his books have dealt with quite a variety of topics. He's never written anything that one would call art criticism per se. And yet, when I met him 3 or 4 years ago, I immediately had the feeling, I want this guy to come and give one of these talks. Because he's got a critical intelligence, and he's also highly educated in ways that mean a lot to me. You know, I wrote this book called The Shape of Ancient Thought, Comparative Studies in Greek and Indian Philosophies. And one of the things that I thought when I first met Peter was, here's a reader for that book. Here's someone I can give a copy of this book to him, and he can just sit down and read it, and I won't need to worry about educating him beforehand. He's already educated himself to the point where he's able to begin that book and read it through to the end with presumably very few glitches in understanding. I've seen books of Peter's that, I would say that if I were trying to define him in an academic sense and to say what his field is, one thing I would mention is Indo-European studies. Another thing I would mention is the Hermetic tradition. And I've read a number of books by him that belong in both of those fields. I remember when someone forgot. I remember when Gordon Wasson came up with his electrifying hypothesis that what the Vedic authors called soma goes back to the Amanita muscaria mushroom, which had to be imported into northern India from Siberia. So one big question that anyone who's interested in these things in an academic way has to face is, how did it get there? And Peter wrote a brilliant book in which he advocated the idea that the mushroom came down and the lines of importation and communication remained open for centuries through the route that leaves from the Ural Mountains. I found his argument convincing, though it was not the conclusion that Wasson himself had come to or that most people accepted. I remember a book of his about old Irish mythology. See, this is the type of thing that Peter has devoted his life to. It's both, on the one hand, it's the history of religion. On another hand, it's the history of thought. And it seems to me that one could see it as relevant to the arts. He is himself a tremendous artist in a variety of ways. I mean, both as a writer and as a speaker, and I leave it for you to experience that tonight. I remember when I first met Peter, it was a winter solstice celebration at David Levi Strauss's house upstate. And this is where I was introduced to a tradition that I had not been aware of, and that is leaping over bonfires. In the dead of night, there was a healthy and happy bonfire flaming in the yard. And I think that I didn't know him, but I saw him. I think that Peter was the first person whom I have ever seen leaping over a bonfire. And that might not seem like such a heroic feat, but then we have to remember that either the next year or the second year after that event, the great artist Mike Bidlow happened to be at Levi Strauss's house, and he presumed to be the first one to jump over the bonfire, and he fell and he broke his leg and he was hauled off to the hospital. There are many things that Peter and I could talk about that we have not talked about yet, and I look forward to the unfolding of life that may include that. But at present, let me just say that it's my honor and pleasure to introduce to you this counterculture guru. Here he is.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you all for coming. Good of you to be here. I guess pretty soon I'm going to start showing slides, so we should dim the lights, but keep a light on me. Yes, that's good. I'm not quite sure what the title of this talk should be, but it has something to do with image magic and something to do with the Egyptian hieroglyphs in the Renaissance. Let me explain that. About 25 years ago, I started a massive reading project to try to understand what the hell was going on. And so I needed to read history, I needed to read sociology, I needed to read anthropology, I needed to read economics. That was really a chore. I was trying to get the whole big picture. And along the way, I realized I needed something to relax, some kind of relaxation as part of this program. So I had heard that during the Renaissance, a number of philosophers, artists, and magicians had become fascinated by the Egyptian hieroglyphs and had made numerous attempts to decipher them, all of which had failed. And so that this was, most historians look on this entire intellectual endeavor as a total waste of time, a rather silly, futile, meaningless, and dusty. So I thought, aha, that sounds perfect. And something that would be really soothing, really relaxing. I can study it. It'll be very erudite, and we'll have lots of bizarre facts and so forth, but will mean absolutely nothing. So I began to look into it. And it didn't take me long to discover that, in fact, I had stumbled on what, to me anyway, turned out to be one of the major keys of my entire study of everything. It was something that I learned from my study of this utter futility, this Renaissance joke, turned out to be, for me anyway, of central philosophical and aesthetic importance, and it helped me to understand all sorts of things. And I should begin by saying that even though they failed to decipher the hieroglyphs, and as I'm sure you know, that wasn't done until Champollion, who was one of the young savants in the wake of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, and someone laid the Rosetta Stone on him, and he was finally able to discover what the Renaissance mages and magicians had never really understood, which was that it's not a purely pictographic language, but that some of the pictures actually represent sounds and some represent ideas. So it's a mixture of pictography and other forms of writing. And because that had never flashed on them, they had failed to understand the hieroglyphs. But the fact that they failed drove their keen intellects and their inquiring souls into a frenzy of attempting to understand these things. And out of that frenzy, an incredible intellectual heritage appeared, or an artistic heritage. And that's what we're going to deal with here tonight in a very quick way. Could I have the first slide? This is Hermes, or Mercury. It says so underneath. You can see Mercurio. This is from a tarot deck painted by the great painter Mantegna, or at least it's attributed to him. I'm not sure whether it's 100% sure that he actually did it. Here you can see this is the god who is the patron of everything that we're going to discuss here, so that's why I'm starting with him. Hermes is also the Egyptian deity Thoth, the one with the ibis head, the head of the ibis bird, also sometimes depicted as a purple-ass baboon, as William Burroughs used to say. And he is the god of wisdom, of language, of theft, of money, of merchants, of magic, and of all the so-called Hermetic arts, which would be, alchemy, astrology, so forth and so on. Hermes himself, of course, would be the subject for an entire lecture. But here I'm just introducing you to him as the patron of what I'm about to talk about, and also as an example of the kind of art that I'm going to deal with here, which generally speaking we can call the emblem. All right, what you see here are attempts to create hieroglyphs. And the artist is Albrecht Dürer, the famous Renaissance German artist. And the text that he is dealing with, this is the only actual book I brought because I wanted to actually quote from it, it's called the Hieroglyphics of Herapolo, or just Herapolo. Now, Herapolo was a 5th century manuscript. It was discovered in the early Renaissance and brought back to Florence and translated from Greek. And it purports to be an explanation of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. But by the 5th century AD, actually no one could actually read the hieroglyphs. Apparently the book was put together by an Egyptian who had some remnants of the tradition. But basically it was not possible to use the Book of Herapolo to decipher any existing Egyptian text. That too much water had gone under the bridge, too much had been lost. But the book made an immense hit. It was a smash hit amongst the intellectuals of Europe, because it offered them the possibility, or they thought it offered them the possibility, of a key to these amazing hieroglyphs that had begun to filter in, actually had been coming in ever since the Roman Empire. Actually, in Italy, they were digging up the Roman Empire and discovering all the Egyptian stuff that the Romans had run off with. So they were discovering Egypt in Rome, not in Egypt. So that was already a drawback that they had to deal with. Now, in the Book of Herapolo, let me explain these hieroglyphs to you. First, we have a dog in a stole. When they denote a magistrate, when they, meaning the Egyptians, denote a magistrate or judge, they place the royal stole beside the dog who is naked, since just as the dog gazes intently upon the images of the gods, so the judge of ancient times contemplated the king in his nakedness, wherefore they add the royal stole to this figure. As far as I know, that has nothing to do with any real Egyptian hieroglyph. The next one, when they wish to indicate a shrine bearer, which I'm not even sure what that is, they draw a house guard, and that's the man sitting there with the stick. Then to denote a horoscopist, a judicial astrologer, they draw a man eating the hours. So Dürer drew somebody literally eating an hourglass, which was the kind of clock that he knew about. For that is impossible, but because food is prepared for man according to the hour. What does it mean? And last, we have to depict purity, they draw fire and water, for through these elements are all things purified. That one at least sounds kind of logical. Not that logic has anything to do with hieroglyphs, mind you. But in effect, none of these only 2 or 3 of these definitions, more or less by accident, turned out to be accurate translations from Egyptian. But there certainly wasn't enough information to decipher anything That had to wait for an actual interlinear text of Greek and Egyptian. Oh, I should mention, by the way, that Dürer himself, oh yeah, it's me, I'm sorry, it's me. I should mention that, don't worry. Dürer himself was one of the artists who was most fascinated by the hieroglyph and the emblem. I mean, here he is trying to work out his own versions. And if you want to study this aspect of his work, there's the one famous drawing, the allegory of melancholy. I'm sure you've all seen it. But this is a perfect example of the Renaissance emblem. It's not always presented that way in art history. If you want to understand what's going on in that picture, you must study this false science of the hieroglyphs in order to understand all the geometric forms and the musical instruments, the scientific instruments, all those things which are littered around the landscape, around the female figure of melancholy who's meditating. Melancholy, of course, was seen as not only a form of insanity, but also as a divine afflatus, an inspiration, so that Saturn, who's the deity who rules over melancholy, also has a strong influence on the creativity, the creative side of philosophy and the arts. Okay. Now, more artists began to try to imagine what hieroglyphs could be. And these examples are from a very famous book published in 1499 called the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili, which means the strife of love in a dream of Polyphilo, who's the main character. And Polyphilo falls asleep, very much like Dante, in the middle of his life, and has an epic dream, except his dream is all about love and sex and architecture and food and perfume. And it's a marvelous, marvelous book. For many, this is another book that I became attracted to because of its reputation for being unreadably stupid and boring. If you read, most of the art historians, they'll tell you this is a book that's interesting for the pictures, which, by the way, used to be attributed to Mantegna, although I don't agree with that. But the pictures are beautiful. I'll show you a couple of more later. But that the text was unreadably stupid and boring, and that it had been written in a made-up language by this Italian monk in 1499. And it was published in Venice by the Aldini, you know, the great Venetian publishing house, who took as their emblem the dolphin and anchor translated. This, I believe that the author of the Hypnerotomachia, who's supposed to be a man named Colonna, I think he may have invented this. It means festinelente, which means make haste slowly. And it was obviously a perfect slogan for a publishing company. And so this book is one of the last of the incunabula, that is, one of the last printed books before 1500. And it was the first book to use an italic typeface. It was the first printed book in which there was an interesting relationship between the illustrations and the text. And if you want to study this, it's been finally translated into English. There's a partial Elizabethan translation, which I studied years ago, which is very good, but it's only a few chapters. And then it was finally translated completely by Jocelyn Godwin, who's professor of music at Colgate University, who did a very good job. And it has all the pictures in it. And there's a paperback edition of it. It's from Thames and Hudson. I recommend you very strongly that you have a look at this book. It's not boring at all. You just have to adjust your dials. You know what I'm saying? You can't expect this to be like sitcom or you know, Raymond Chandler or something. This is very slow reading. And you have to be able to get into the weirdness of the idea of a man who's moving through an erotic landscape to such an extent that buildings have orgasms. It's truly, I mean, I don't know whether, I don't think André Breton knew about this book or he would have loved it. It really is proto-surrealist masterpiece. So there you can see the kind of intellectual game that they were playing with the idea of the Egyptian hieroglyph, that a picture could be translated into words. And there are different ways that you could do that. There are different ways that you could translate a picture into a word. I mean, the most obvious is the visual pun, which we call the rebus. Here you have an example of an alchemical text called the Book of Lamsprinck. And supposedly the alchemist who made this book may have been called Lamsprinck, or it might have been his pen name, or it might have been his slogan. We're not sure. But there you can see the idea of a visual pun, very simple, a lamb springing out of a lamb. It's his coat of arms. And that's, I guess that's a rebus. Not quite a rebus, but something very close to a rebus, certainly a visual pun. They're called punning crests or canting crests in heraldry, where you use... well, I can give you an example from my own family. Some of my relatives, Scottish relatives, are called Cranston, and their coat of arms is a crane holding a stone. Okay, crane stone. So that's a punning crest. And this is also a punning crest. But at the same time, we're getting a mystical message here. First of all, because of the lamb as the symbol of Christianity, or Jesus himself. And as you can see from the one example below of illustrations from this wonderful book, it's one of the most beautiful of the alchemical emblem books. This picture of the two fish probably should be taken to symbolize, first of all, the astrological sign of Pisces and everything that relates to it, since the sign of Pisces is also two fish in exactly that relationship. But you see what a wonderful job the artist has done painting in a very kind of, at one and the same time, a utopian and believable Northern European landscape. I mean, there it is. It's perfect. It's beautiful. It sucks you in. You want to go there. You want to live there. But it's not just purely a magical utopia. Everything isn't crazy. Just those two weird fish in the foreground. They're the crazy part. And you'll see the way that works out in emblems. And I'll have a great deal more to say about the relationship between the foreground and the background in emblems. By the way, I should tell you now that a lot of these illustrations, not all of them, but a lot of them are from two books put together by a man named Klosowski, who's the brother of the famous artist Balthus, and was himself, or geez, I think he's dead now, so I speak of him in the past. He was a great scholar of Hermeticism, and alchemy, and magic. And he put together two collections of art, one for Thames and Hudson, the English publisher in those that series of large, oversized floppies that they published on different spiritual subjects. That one is just called Alchemy. And then he put together a very large, very wonderful book called The Golden Game of black and white emblem art, Hermetic emblem art. And if you read those two books, I'm telling you, you will be well grounded in Hermeticism. That you really won't need much more than that for a very smart, very clear, and very, because of all the pictures, very sweet and tasty and enjoyable introduction to Hermeticism. So look out for those books. I think actually they're both still in print. All right, so that's Lamspring, and that shows you how the emblems... See, what they did was they thought to themselves, okay, the hieroglyph is a picture that means a word, but we're not sure which word. So they invented the emblem, which is a picture and a word, to make sure you don't make a mistake. It's like a picture and a caption, and I'll show you some of that. Let's see, are we coming up on that? Well, not yet. This is from the Aurora Consurgens, a 14th century manuscript. Again, collected by Klosowski. This is the Hermaphrodite. I really just picked this to... I mean, the Hermaphrodite itself is a hieroglyph, you might say. In alchemy, the hermaphrodite signifies the conjunction, the alchemical marriage, so to speak, in which the male and the female literally become one. It's not just sex, in other words, it's a kind of mystical marriage. And on the level of chemicals, this could mean sulfur and mercury coming together as cinnabar, for example, in one stone. So the masculine and feminine principles present in a single stone could be seen as a hermaphrodite. So the idea of the rebus, of the visual pun, of the hieroglyph, of the emblem, is now being extended, not just or being extended beyond just mere textuality, if I can put it that way, and into metatextuality, which is pretty obvious since it's not a simple text. Here you don't see any words, but no word is necessary because anyone can tell this is the hermaphrodite, and that the black bird lurking behind, and probably the bat and the rabbit as well, all have specific meanings to do with the stage in alchemy known as the negredo, or putrefactio, which here it is. Putrefactio is when the elements in your alembic, in your flask, are sort of turn nasty and black. And then you have to, it's at this point you begin the very slow heating, sometimes over they say, using as fuel just the manure of a pregnant mare. Not burning it, just, because it generates a little tiny bit of heat. And so you bury the alembic in the manure, and the sulfur and mercury, if that's what we're using, gradually, in the midst of this putrefaction or rot, there's something interior going on where they begin to come together. And later on in this same series, this is from the Donum Dei, or the Pretiosissimum Donum Dei, the most precious gift of God, by George Anrach, a 17th century alchemist. And there's a whole, I didn't put them all in because they're all the same figures, basically copulating figures in a vessel, but different colors appear as the alchemical process goes along. And so that finally when you get to in the Western system, to a bright golden ruby red, that you have achieved the philosopher's stone. And then you break open the alembic, and you have the stone, which can be used as an elixir of perfect health or to transmute base materials into higher materials, such as lead into gold. Beginning with the Egyptian hieroglyphs, we're now well into the something else which also began in Egypt, but has a huge spurt of development during the Renaissance, and that is alchemy, the Hermetic science par excellence. And this is largely to do with, as I said, first of all, with the rediscovery of texts such as this, and even more with the rediscovery of the Corpus Hermeticum, which is a large body of Greek writings attributed to Hermes and to his family, the god that I began by showing you. So these were thought to be books directly revealed by Hermes himself. They were discovered and brought to Italy. The Medicis got hold of them, and they were in the middle of a project of translating Plato at that moment. They said, "Drop that. That's not important. We've got something really important here, the Corpus Hermeticum," which they believed at that time was the oldest book of humanity. So it even preceded the Bible, much less Plato. So naturally, they thought it was more important. Turns out, once again, just like with the Hieropylo, they were wrong. It's probably dates to the 1st century BC, 1st century AD, to that kind of period when Gnosticism and Christianity and all those other ideas were blossoming and floating around in the Eastern Mediterranean. And it's not ancient Egyptian at all, although then, as soon as this was discovered in the 15th century, the academic world, the world of serious philosophy and science, said, "Oh, it's fake, therefore it can't be important," which is an even worse mistake than the Renaissance mages and the Medici had made, because that meant that the Corpus Hermeticum was thrown out, crushed, suppressed, became part of the occult underground, was known as a fake book. So, in antiquity, if you were inspired by Hermes to write a book, you would put Hermes' name on it, because otherwise you'd be seen as a big egotist, big egomaniac. I mean, this was the polite way to do it in the 1st century. And it's not that it's a fake book. In fact, in recent years, It's been reassessed again by scholars of ancient Egyptian religion who now think that it's actually full of authentic motifs and figures from late Ptolemaic, Roman Egyptian, the last period of Egypt when it was still Egypt, before Christianity. So alchemy also begins in Egypt at around this time. The earliest alchemical manuscripts date from about this period. They're written in Greek, and they're mostly to be traced to the Eastern Mediterranean and especially to Egypt. So these texts also are getting dug up, rediscovered, sold to rich aristocrats, mostly in Italy. Also, a great deal of information arrives from the Byzantine Empire, especially one person, Gemistoplathon, a fascinating figure who, the last of the Platonists, came from Greece to Florence and turned everybody on to this. He must have been a very charismatic and magical individual. He got everybody totally inspired about all this material, and really is a central figure, Plathon. He even named himself after Plato. And the Medicis in Florence started an academy. It was run by Marsilio Ficino, who eventually did get back to work translating Plato and did the first translations into Latin of Plato, and wrote beautiful books on magic, wonderful books on magic. I think actually my favorite book on magic is The Books of Life by Marsilio Ficino, translated by Charles Bohr, the Fluxus guy, and with an introduction by Dick Higgins. The Fluxus people took up Ficino and Giordano Bruno, another extremely important Italian magus who was burnt at the stake by the Vatican in the year 1600. That book is very hard to find, but The Books of Life by Ficino, but if you can track it down, maybe you'll find rare and expensive copies on the internet or something. I don't know. I strongly recommend it. This is the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. This text, which says, "as above, so below," it's the origin of that famous slogan, the quintessential slogan of Hermeticism. As above in heaven, so below. Correspondences, as Baudelaire called them, les correspondances, between all the levels of reality. So that, for example, the sun and the lion correspond with each other. It's not just a metaphor, it's not just allegory, it's a symbol, which is to say that it's the thing itself as well as a representation of the thing itself. So that somehow the lion is the sun, is the diamond, is the orange-yellow flame, right? That whole series, there's equal signs. They're kind of mystical equal signs because the forms are different, but somehow the essences are the same. So this is the text that teaches us that. It probably comes from Arabic originally, although we don't have the Arabic original. It appears in Latin at first, and is one of the oldest known, was known even in the Middle Ages as a Hermetic text. And here we see a wonderful realization of it by Heinrich Kunrath, the great northern, I think he was German, alchemist. This is from his book, what's it called again? Oh yes, The Amphitheater of Wisdom. That could be where we're here, where we are tonight. The Amphitheatrum Sapientiae of Heinrich Kunrath. Okay? And here he shows the emerald tablet as a mountain. And we should visualize this mountain as translucent and green. It is actually a huge mountain of emerald. And at the base of it, you see the philosophers discussing it. And around it, you see, once again, one of these utopian landscapes that's both real and unreal at the same time. There you can see typical, German church there in the background, church spires, and a river with ships in it. And the philosophers themselves are dressed in the street garb of the period. But they're standing in front of this miraculous, huge tablet of emerald, which is revealing all the wisdom of Hermeticism. And I like to think of, in fact, of this as a symbol of Hermetic writing itself, which is endless. There's no end to books on alchemy. They just, there's heaps and piles of them. Nobody knows who writes them. They're anonymous. They seem to come from a world which is not quite material and isn't quite all there. They exist in every language, and they seem to say very much the same thing, whether they're written in Chinese or Arabic, or English, for that matter. The messages of alchemy get repeated over and over again across the entire old world. The idea of sulfur and mercury basically as your yang and yin also exists in China. The same exact substances, I mean. So clearly we're talking about a system which really did get diffused across a huge area of the world. A lot of modern academics hate the whole idea of diffusionism. They think that ancient people were too stupid to walk and never talked to each other because they spoke different languages. And so, I mean, this is something that Tom has spent, 30 years of his life disproving this kind of nonsense and showing that there was a deep and continual connection between Greece and India. And part of that connection was about, it's a period somewhat later to the period that he deals with in his book, was about this transmission of the Hermetic sciences, including astrology, which turns out that there's a lot of similarity between our traditional Babylonian, Mesopotamian-based astrology and Indian so-called Vedic astrology. For example, the planet Mercury is obviously the same character in India as he is for us. In other words, Mercury or Hermes, a god whose stone is a green emerald in India, who is in charge of language and of wisdom and of the Hermetic sciences. I mean, it's the same god. The Mesopotamian god Nebo, or the Egyptian god Thoth, the Greek Hermes, or the later alchemical Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest Hermes, who is usually considered to have been a real human being who's an avatar of Hermes, and maybe there were 3 of him, that's why he's thrice greatest, or maybe it's just because he was 3 times greater than anybody else. No one is ever quite sure about these things, but Hermes turns up in Christian art in the Renaissance as one of the wise pagans. You can read about them in Dante, the ones who end up in limbo because they're not Christians, so they can't go to heaven, but they're not evil, so they can't go to hell. And these wise pagans foretell the coming of Jesus. So the Sibyl, the Delphic oracle, Hermes, all of these great magical prophetic figures of late antiquity, or who take their final form in late antiquity, all then reappear again in the Renaissance or the late Middle Ages as precursors of Christianity, and therefore okay. In other words, by saying that they foretold Jesus, then it became okay to study them. They were no longer evil, wicked pagans. So this was an important intellectual step to adopt a figure like Hermes and make him appear, as he does, on a mosaic on the walls of the Cathedral of Siena. I wish I'd brought that picture with me. It's a very nice one. And it's not the only place he appears in Christian art. So I just wanted to give this image of this impossible heap of writing, which is what Hermeticism consists of. Hermeticism is a path in which the flagstones themselves are books. You walk a path of books in Hermeticism. I'm not saying that you can get it all out of books without any help from other human beings, although even that is said by many. There are many Hermeticists who say that books themselves can be initiatic. And I strongly believe that a book like the Hypnerotomachia Polyphily is an initiatic experience. Or let's say The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosencrantz, which was the novel that founded the Rosicrucian movement. Also a beautiful book which I recommend that you read. But adjust your dials, so you don't expect it to be James Bond. It's an alchemical allegory about a Christian Rosicross going on a pilgrimage, seeking out the castle of wisdom, and where the divine male and female principles are going to be celebrating their cosmic marriage. And so the whole thing is an allegory of alchemy, an allegory of chivalry, an allegory of romantic love, and even a political tract, which that's too complicated to get into. But there was a politics behind all this too. Generally speaking, I won't say, maybe anti-authoritarian may be going a bit too far, but usually it's not central orthodoxy that we're dealing with here. Even in the height of the Renaissance, when the Medicis and other rich people and kings and cardinals were patronizing this stuff, it never became totally orthodox. And there was always something suspect about it. And then a reaction set in. You've probably heard of Savonarola, the terrible monk, Dominican monk of Florence, who had the bonfire of the vanities, in which all the art and books and poetry and lutes and perfumes and everything were thrown into a huge bonfire in the middle of the city of Florence. And that was pretty much the end of the early Renaissance, or a symbol of it anyway. And after that, a lot of these things were forced to go underground. And Bruno was burned at the stake, you know. And when the Rosicrucian Enlightenment was crushed by the 30 Years' War, Rosicrucianism was an attempt to have a world religion of Hermeticism that would unite Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And of course it failed. And one of the reasons why it failed, although, you know, for a while there, they actually had several kings and even an emperor, Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire, was probably part of this scheme until he turned a little bit, he got reactionary in his old age and betrayed his occult followers. But at one point it actually looked like there was going to be a revolution, it was going to be a mystical revolution, and it was going to basically overthrow the Roman Catholic Church. So we have a lot of Protestants getting involved in this too now, and we also have people who go to the East. And Christian Rosicrucianism, who may or may not have actually existed, in the book that they wrote about him, he goes to the East, he goes to Damascus and Fez. Paracelsus, the great alchemist, 15th century alchemist, goes to, and he's a real character for sure, a real historical person. He goes to Constantinople and beyond to visit the Tartars, the wild Tartars, or Tatars, in which he discovers shamanism. And this is extraordinary. This 15th, 16th century German alchemist going to somewhere east of Istanbul and meeting shamans and saying, all right, there's something to learn from these people. Paracelsus is famous for saying he learned more from illiterate old peasant women than he ever learned from doctors who had been trained in the universities. The Hermeticists were not establishmentarian figures. Just by their very nature, they tended to be somewhat rebellious and underground. And when the traditions themselves were driven underground, first by the church and then by the triumph of modern science, then it became actually, at certain points, dangerous to practice these things. You know, the illiterate women got burned at the stake, but even the literate men who were involved in this could get into deep trouble, again, like Bruno, who was roasted for his troubles. This is an image from probably the most brilliant of all the alchemical emblem books. It's called the Atalanta Fugians of Count Michael Mayer, who was a member of the Rosicrucians in Prague. It was one of the circle of Rudolph II that I just was talking about. And by his period, which is, I guess, the late 1500s, very early 1600s, this whole tradition that began with the rediscovery of Egyptian hieroglyphs has now reached a peak, I think, a really great artistic peak is reached with this book, Atalanta Fugians, which I would call the first Gesamtkunstwerk in the sense that Wagner used the term, an artwork that combines all the arts. Now here we see not just the image and the caption, but also music. He composed a fugue for every one of the images in the book with words. You can get a recording of this along with the translation of this book, once again by Jocelyn Godwin, who I think has done more for modern Hermetic scholarship than almost anybody in America. He did a wonderful translation of this book with a CD, or, well, actually, in the day it was a cassette tape, but it's probably a CD now. To find this, go to the website that's run by Adam McLean, M-C-L-E-A-N, or is it M-A-C-L-E-A-N? Does anybody know? Just M-C-L-E-A-N. And do you know the name of his website?
Yes,
Pipex? Pipex.com. If there's any copies of the book available, you could probably get it through him. Also, he is a great scholar of all this stuff, of Renaissance Hermeticism. He's published many translations. He took over Fanny's Press. Or rather, Fanny's Press took over him, and then Fanny's Press died, but Adam is still running the website. He got some of the stock. Anyway. Yeah, Fanny's Press is my old friends in Grand Rapids, and they went belly up a couple of years ago. They finally gave up the struggle. There's not a lot of money to be made in magic. There's not a lot of grants get given in the field of occult science anymore. You know, if only there were some Medicis around. Anyway, let me go back a minute to go back to this is Boreas, the wind. Isn't he wonderful? And he's one of the most spectacular emblems of, just by himself, of the whole Renaissance. It just says it's this Promethean energy. And once again, look at the landscape. You can see this is the art. The art is done. The engravings are. Nobody knows who did the original art. It may have been Michael Mayer himself, but the engravings were done by Theodore de Brie in Amsterdam, who produced some of the most beautiful of all printed books of the Renaissance. And this is, I think, the most beautiful. So you get a poem, a prose explanation, or a label. Let's say the label is there at the top. It says he carries the wind in his belly. Emblem 1, about secret nature. He carries in his belly the wind. And then underneath is the epigram, which enlarges on that concept, and then you get the fugue, which sets the epigram to music. And you get it also in German black letter, in case you need in German as well. So I mean, this is why I call it a Gesamtkunstwerk, a complete artwork. You could do a stage version of this. It's an extremely dramatic work. I have other pictures from it later, you'll see. Obelisks. The obelisk is, of course, they dragged obelisks off from Egypt. You know, one of the popes got one of Cleopatra's needles from Alexandria. The other one kept on lying there for hundreds of years until we got it. It's in Central Park. I'll show you that. There it is. Our Cleopatra's needle. Now, the obelisk is supposed to be, I don't know, I can't vouch for this out of my own knowledge, but they say that the obelisk is a perfect mathematical representation of a sun ray. It has exactly the same angles on its sides that a sun ray coming down to Earth is supposed to have. How do they know this? I don't know. That's what they say. And it was very clear to the Pope and to many other kings and politicians in the Renaissance, in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, that these had been like magical antennae of royal power for the pharaohs. They didn't have the concept of an antenna, but it was very trying to emerge from their mind. They thought that because it was a sunbeam, because it was pointy, because it had four sides, because you could put it where everybody could see it, that it broadcast magic. So they would invent hieroglyphs to put on their own obelisks. Now this one was designed by one of my favorite dudes, Athanasius Kircher, who was fairly late in this story, who made a very, very heroic attempt to understand the hieroglyphs. He devoted several volumes to it. He actually intuited that there would be some connection between ancient Egyptian and Coptic, which turned out to be true, but even that was not enough for him to crack the hieroglyphs. So, in frustration, he invented his own. And this one he designed for the Emperor Ferdinand. I don't know whether Ferdinand accepted it or had it built. I think rather not, because we don't have any pictures of it anyway. But this was his idea. I don't know what the hieroglyphs are supposed to mean either, but you can look and see there's all sorts of powerful symbols there. And it's going to be broadcasting the power of the emperor in a magical way. And it behooves us not to laugh too much at this idea. And I want to say more about that in my conclusion, but I just want to put it into your head now that these are not, that you could have a psychological interpretation of this if you want. If you read Giordano Bruno on magic, and on emblem magic in particular, it's never really clear that he's saying that this is supernatural, that the effect is supernatural. He could be talking about psychology. The text certainly exists on a psychological level, and yet it's a psychology which is still quite alien and remote to us in our post-Freudian, post-Jungian, even post-Jungian world. Jung said that the alchemists prediscovered the subconscious. I think this is a bit misleading. Maybe even to use the word subconscious is a bit misleading. Certainly they discovered that the image goes directly, it bypasses the critical faculty, the verbal, abstract, rational faculty, and goes straight to some part of the mind, brain, soul, which we call the or subconscious, a term which means is no more than a name on a map. The map is not the territory. Well, the map is the territory to a certain extent, but in this case, where we should think about modern propaganda in terms of this obelisk. How different is it if the broadcasting is being done from a television tower that looks actually very much like an obelisk? It's still the same images with captions so that you don't make any mistakes, and it's changing your mind, or at least that's a presumption. We like to think we're too intelligent to be influenced by these things, but can we always be 100% sure that we're not on some hidden level, some level is not precisely not accessible to our daylight conscious mind, being swept away by this sea of imagery, this inundating, endless ocean of this obscene paroxysm of imagery that the modern world consists of. These images had power for these people back then because there weren't a lot of images. The rare image stood out. It was rare. It was something special. And so they could understand maybe better than we can the power of an individual image or emblem. But we who are drowned in emblems may not any longer be aware of the powerful, really, really powerful magic, if you'll allow me the word, that's going on. I want to get back to that idea. There's Cleopatra's Needle again. You should all make a pilgrimage. And I just want to mention heraldry. I mentioned it a little bit before, but it's another Hermetic art which will help us to understand the way these images are working. You know that if you're an aristocrat, you can have a coat of arms. In fact, you don't have to be an aristocrat. You can have a coat of arms too. Anyone can have a coat of arms if they want it. Anything or any idea, any place, anything could have a coat of arms. Anything that needs to be both protected and expressed at the same time. And that could be anything. It could be you, it could be your house, it could be your dog. Your dog probably needs a coat of arms. Anyway, here's the sun and the moon having a joust, and each of them bears the opposite sign on their shields. So once again, here we have the mystical marriage again, only this time it's in the form of a battle. Well, love is that way sometimes. So heraldry is again not just, I said that, for example, the punning crest, the crane holding the stone. Okay, it's not just a pun. It probably goes much deeper than that. In my opinion, the crane was probably the shamanic bird of the family that eventually adapted that crest. And we know that the crane was a sacred bird to the Celts, as well as to the ancient Chinese and the ancient Egyptians. In fact, the crane, ibis, heron, that whole family of birds is sacred everywhere. It's sacred in the New World to the Native Americans, sacred in the Old World. Wherever the stork appears, it's magic, it's it's a little strange. And so we know that the Celtic shamans had cloaks made out of crane feathers. They had bags made out of crane feathers. Yeats has written about the crane bag. And we know that the Celtic shamans turned into cranes, just as the Taoist shamans or alchemists rode on the backs of cranes, or perhaps became cranes. So I think that heraldry is often telling us something about the history of the family that's magical. This could be, for example, if you saw something like this on a shield, and in fact, that's fairly common. By the way, this is another one. These last two were collected by Klosowski again. And they're both from the Thames and Hudson book. I think they're both extraordinarily good versions. Here we have the mermaid. Well, there are French families who have mermaids on their coats of arms because they're descended from mermaids, from the famous, I call her the freshwater mermaid, Melusine, gave birth to one of the great aristocratic royal ducal lines of southern France, and she is on their coat of arms. Why? Because those people were probably shamans at one point, or magicians, witches, if you like. Probably a lot of what Margaret Murray thought of as the survival of European paganism in witchcraft also went into heraldry. So heraldry is not, I mean, a lot of people find heraldry really boring. Again, it's one of these things I took up because most people find it incredibly dull. And yet, to me, it's always been very fascinating and very surrealistic. And once you get over the idea of it being snobbery, it becomes totally fascinating. The whole history, from one point of view, is just the study of families, and heraldry is the key to that study. So wherever heraldry appears, you have a wonderful key to history. The joust is from Aurora Consurgens, and the mermaid is from Solidonius in the 18th century, quite late, actually. Where are we going with all this? We were headed for the unconscious, or the subconscious, as I prefer, because the unconscious sounds like you're never going to get there, but at least you could dive under and get to. So Jung says the alchemists discovered the subconscious. I say the whole terminology is a bit misleading. The cutting off of, the artificial slicing off of a subconscious from a supraconscious, for example, is something that mars the Jungian project. It would be better if we would just think in terms of the sacred imagination. And here I think we have a wonderful emblem of the sacred imagination. This is from the Splendor Solis, another great alchemical treatise. And we see the moon here. This is the moon, the deity that really rules over imagination and vision and intoxication. In India, the moon is Soma, which is the Amanita muscaria, perhaps, or anyway, the drug that causes divine intoxication. So there's the moon, which is both sinking into, rising out of, merging and emerging from yet another one of these sacred or utopian landscapes. This is perfect. Part of it's submerged, like the subconscious. Part of it's in the sky, like the supraconscious. It's the moon. It's dark. It's night, so it's dreamlike. It's silvery, starry. Or perhaps it's the moon seen during the day, which again is a yin-yang, sulfur-mercury thing, the sun and the moon in the sky at once, often a symbol of the great work in alchemy. But in any case, that to me is a picture which just says the power of the imagination as something more than just daydream and fancy and idle, what you might think of as idle imagination. For the alchemists and for the mystics, the imagination is a faculty that's divine. It belongs to God, him, or herself. Because where do physical things come from? Physical things are like the images produced by God as an artist, and God is the great imaginator, great creator of images. God created the human in his own image. so that the human body itself is the most perfect emblem of the divine. This is actually my favorite allegory of the imagination. This is from Atalanta, Fugians, again, of Count Michael Mayer. And here we see fishing for coral. There's nothing very complicated about this idea, in my view. It's that coral is hidden underwater as dreams and visions are hidden beneath the level of consciousness. And the job of the alchemist here is to bring them up into consciousness. When you bring the coral into the water, it hardens and changes from a plant into a gem, as we know. I mean, it actually does that. And so it was of great interest to the alchemists who saw it as a symbol of transmutation. But more than that, it's always seemed to me to be the symbol of poetry itself. And here I think we have one of the most wonderful of all the utopian landscapes that the coral fisherman has posed. We could allegorize that landscape, the bridge over waters and so forth and so on, or we could just, the city in the background, perhaps it's the earthly Jerusalem. There's Boreas blowing the winds again, the blessings of the wind, of the air principle, earth, air, fire, water. The ruined fisherman, the rundown fisherman's hut there, it's actually not ruined. It's just kind of quaint. And it's all so beautiful, and it just sucks you in and makes you want to live there in that magical landscape where that magical fishing is going on, that pulling up out of the soul, out of the dark soul, out of the deep water into the red coral. And the red, of course, is the stone. The philosopher's stone itself is red. So coral is a prefiguration of the philosopher's stone. A moist plant grows beneath Sicilian waves, and in warm water multiplies each branch. It has the name of coral and grows hard when Boreas sends his frost down from the north. It then becomes a red, much fronded stone, the stone of physic, well resembling. Physic, the stone of physic, in other words, the cure-all, the stone of all physicians, all doctors. Piranesi. I love the one on the bottom. It's actually painted on the wall of the English tea house in Rome, near the Spanish Steps. And unless they've torn it down, it's still there. I don't think they would do that. Piranesi came quite late in this story, but he also loved the Egyptian stuff, and he devoted several books to his Egyptian fantasies, all based on stuff that he'd seen in private collections in Rome. He'd never been to Egypt, of course. And he did a whole series of Egyptian fireplace designs. That's what that is on the top there. Piranesi is a great artist, and I just wanted you to see that it's not all these anonymous artists of the emblem books who are fascinated by the emblems. In fact, if you want to understand anything about Renaissance art, you'd better study this science. That's what the Warburg Kuthold Institute has been doing for the last, 70 years. And I'm not sure they've got it even yet. They did great work and everything, but they didn't study magic enough yet. They need to actually study the texts even more. But that's the kind of thing, you can't interpret Botticelli unless you know this stuff. You can't look at the La Primavera and understand what's going on in that painting unless you understand this science of emblems. Or at least if you know that they're meant to be emblems, even that's a great step forward, and one which not many art historians take. Here's another illustration from the Hypnerotomachia Polyphily. This is actually a page out of Godwin's translation. This is Polyphilo with nymphs at the fountain of Venus. Actually, no, I'm sorry, this is from an article I wrote. The writing on the page is from an article I wrote about the Hypnerotomachia Polyphily in the late lamented magazine Alexandria, which was put out by Fanny's Press and is no more. If you can find back issues of it, some great stuff all about Renaissance Hermeticism. So there you see the garden. I've been showing you gardens, landscapes, because of their utopian qualities. I mean, one of the things about Hermeticism and its politics is the idea of a return to a golden age, and when there would be no war, no kings, there would actually be no state, where it would be like what Hesiod wrote about in the where he talks about the Hyperboreans, the figures that Nietzsche wrote so much about, the mythical Hyperboreans, those who live beyond the north wind, beyond Boreas, in a land where it's always mild, where they live for almost forever, not quite, but almost forever. They're very long-lived. They don't make war. They're vegetarians. Everything. It's the golden age. And Hermeticism is going to turn us. It's going to cause a great reversion in psychic history that will make us go back to the golden age. Because revolutions are not always leaps forward. Sometimes they're leaps back. Especially in the ancient world, revolution was often seen as a return to a primordial perfection that would come once again in a kind of millenarian way. And whenever I see one of these great Renaissance gardens or landscapes, I'm drawn again into that whole political dream. On one level, it's not the transmutation of elements we're looking at here, but the transmutation of the soul and of the social soul as well. And here we see Polyphilo, the one male figure, in a paradise garden where the goddess Venus and her nymphs are entertaining him, and yet he's still bewildered and unhappy because his beloved that he's been seeking all through this magical land is not in the garden. So it's a combination of great sensuality, mysticism, and anguish, all at the same time. Once again, to me, a world of the imagination. This landscape is both the real world and the world of the imagination. And these are sculptures. I don't know, pictures are not too readable, are they? These are large garden sculptures in a place in northern Italy called Bomarzo. Anybody ever heard of Bomarzo? Or been there? Yeah, a few people. Bomarzo was built by a Duke Orsini, who was a hunchback and a recluse and a madman and an alchemist, and extremely rich. And he had his palace at Bomarzo, and then down underneath the palace he had local stonemasons come in and carve statues to his own designs. Some of them are taken from the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili. Actually, and they're realizations in stone. But these are not the slick, really good sculptures of the urban Renaissance. These are country stonemasons who are trying their best to work to the ideas of a sophisticated a magician. And the results are extraordinary. That mouth building there is big enough to walk into, okay? There you see a close-up of it, and you can walk inside there too. And how many of you remember, you must have in the old days gone to the carnival, and it's the house where all the angles are wrong, and you're walking down, but you feel like you're walking up, and that's that house. And then there's a griffin or a gorgon, and these are all huge. Also, there's a mermaid. There's many images. The mermaid with a double tail, which is taken straight out of the Hypnerotomachia, but I didn't bring that picture. So now you see the emblems also being realized in 3 dimensions in stone here. It isn't only just books with black and white drawings or paintings. It's also sculpture and architecture. For example, the Grotto. This is an imaginary grotto. I don't know if it was ever realized. We have a whole series of imaginary animals shooting water over a central fountain. One of the streams is holding a ping pong ball or something up in midair. Obviously, a very magical and mysterious atmosphere would be created by the fake stalagmites and stalactites. This is the kind of dark, unconscious dream state of the Renaissance garden. A lot of it is out in the sunlight. It's geometric. It's got the beautiful plane trees and cypress trees. It's all very, in a way, very how can we say, very classical and sunlit, and yet at the same time, something weird is going on in these Renaissance gardens. For one thing, you very seldom see any Christian symbolism in a lot of these gardens. In Bomarzo, for example, there's not a single Christian symbol. And my old friend Elimir Zola, who rest in peace, but he introduced me to the idea that he was an Italian alchemist and scholar who introduced me to the idea that there was actually a conscious conspiracy among some of the noblemen around the Romagna and southern Tuscany and Rome, including the Lord of Bomarzo and others in that same region. The Villa d'Este, for example, is another one where you don't see any Christian symbols. He thinks that there was an actual secret society or cabal of neo-pagans who were, including some cardinals of the church, who were basically going to, were running a secret rebellion against Catholicism and expressing it in their gardens. They were all very rich. They could afford to do that. And in the art they paid for. And this idea that the Renaissance art is full of pagan gods and goddesses, but we shouldn't take it seriously because they're just allegorical and they're just being used to show Christian virtues. No. Sometimes yes, but sometimes no. And it's going to behoove us as art historians to be able to tell the difference when we see it. Some of it's quite conscious. Another mountain, another Sacromonte, like our Emerald Tablet Mountain. This one you can see it's hollow. And there, this character is said to be Boaz, the farmer of Bethlehem. If you know your Bible well, you may recognize this character. I didn't, actually. But clearly he's the alchemist. And he's about to... And the sexuality which is going to take place there is already prefigured by the snails and rabbits, I think. Rabbits, you know what rabbits do, right? And snails are kind of like genital symbols or something. It's very, very strongly unconscious. But at the top there, the red castle with the angel is once again the emergence into full or meta consciousness of an uber consciousness of the philosopher's stone, of the transforming through the imagination of the whole corpus of physical and spiritual being into this transcendent ruby, as here, or elsewhere, otherwise emerald. Especially in the Islamic world, the philosopher's stone is often green rather than red, but anyway, here it's red. And the hollow mountain, the mountain itself is the lingam, but the fact that it's hollow makes it the yoni, the fact that it's got a deep subconscious and a high angelic metaconscious, all these are yin, once again, yin-yang, Mercury, sulfur, male, female, night, day, heaven, earth, dualisms which are going to be resolved into active monisms, if I can put it that way. This is, I think, one of the most beautiful etchings of all the alchemical works by a very interesting author named Beroald de Verville. There's his name there on the last line. Writing about 1600, 1610, about the same time as Bruno, Giordano Bruno, the same time as the Rosicrucians in Prague. He was in Paris. A disciple, or anyway, a lover of Rabelais. He wrote an imitation of Rabelais that was translated by that Welsh horror, Arthur Machen. Arthur Machen translated one of Beroald's books. This one, The Voyage of the Fortunate Princes, has never been translated. I have no idea what it's about, actually. But he calls it an oeuvre stenographique. Steganography is code. It's something which says one thing but means something else. It's usually code in the simple sense of the word. But for Beroald, it's more than just code. It's the alchemical language that hides truths about both the soul and material chemicals under an allegory, which is not just allegory. It's not just empty metaphor, but which is living symbols. And here you can see some of them. There's the sacred marriage up there at the top, Jupiter and the eagle. You've got Venus with the tree growing into her belly, or she is in fact the fruit of the tree. Then the king embracing the dragon. That's another sulfur Mercury emblem. And finally, it's all taking place over another utopian garden. In this case, a very French-looking one, very Versailles-looking French garden, not the kind of proto-romantic landscapes of the northern artists. Here you see something a little more Latinate, and yet very bizarre and very surrealist. Beroald de Verville also did a magnificent edition of the Hypnerotomachia Polyphily, in which he or somebody redrew all the art and did a frontispiece for it like this, which I didn't bring, but you can see it in Klosowski's Golden Game. And it's like an allegorical or a symbolical map of the whole book, which I presume this is also too. This is actually telling us whatever was going on in this book, we're looking at the gist of it here in these emblems. And once you've read the book, you go back and look at these emblems and their wisdom would unfold. Here's the title page of Atalanta Fugians. Also, as I told you, my favorite of the absolute favorite of all the emblem books. Is also, I think, one of the great title pages of all times. Again, you see the mixture of image and writing. Even the characters are labeled. There down at the bottom, you see Atalanta and Hippomenes having their race, and the male and female lion. Then everything else is taking place, as you see, inside a garden with a wicker fence like that. That often symbolizes the Virgin Mary is enclosed in a garden made out of that kind of wicker work. So we can tell that something sacred is taking place. And I won't go into, there's Hercules on this side, and Typhon, the dragon, up there at the top, and so forth and so on. But it's, and again, they're all moving through this wonderful landscape, which itself is a character. It should be seen as one of the characters. Atalanta fleeing, with the golden apples. That is new emblems of the secret chemical nature by Michael Meyer, the imperial consular of Rudolph II. Later, by the 18th century, this whole emblem book thing is becoming what Walter Benjamin, the great German critic, calls melancholy. He sees that there's a melancholy about the emblems, a kind of sadness, which is both Dürer's melancholy, the creative melancholy of the Renaissance sage, and also the sick melancholy. When the symbolism is overwhelmed by allegory, when the imagination is overwhelmed by the ideology, when we're really looking at a one-to-one equivalence rather than a deep, multi-layered, multi-dimensional, polyphonic unfolding of an image into many images, we're simply looking at one simple image that means one simple thing. This struck Benjamin as particularly depressing and melancholy, as a sort of decay of this tradition. And here we see from a fairly late 17th century German Lutheran pietist named Johann Arndt, whose book's never been republished, and these pictures have never appeared in modern books anywhere, so I brought a few of them to show you, of the late, what I consider rather, look, it's even gotten dark and claustrophobic, held within these very tight oval frames, spectacles, a watch. And we're no longer seeing gods and goddesses here. We're seeing actual creations of 18th century rationalism and science being allegorized in pietistic ways. Don't ask me to explain how. I can't read the book. As you can see, it's even Germans I've had in my house can't read this book. But you can imagine the sort of thing he's saying, right? It's time flies, you should pray more. Melancholy. Now the landscape isn't so much utopian as it is just sad. That one's pretty bizarre. It seems to be picking flames. I have no idea. Don't ask me. Dark clouds. What's going on here? It's a baby tied up in the cradle. I don't know. It's all very sinister and has a sort of sinister and oppressive feel to it, don't you think? Foreboding. Our last two pictures, everybody knows who this is, of course, Joseph Beuys. This is his Celtic event, which he did in Scotland. And again, I'm going to be unable to tell you what that emblem of his means. He used to do these emblems on blackboards with chalk, and then he would throw them away immediately. Some of them got saved, others he would throw away or even erase to do new ones. This, I don't know what the letters are standing for here. It looks like an L and an H, and then I don't know what the first one looks like, an upside-down T to me. I'm not sure. Oh, no, it's a T. Oh, yeah, the foot of the T goes down into the boat. So it's TLH. I have no idea what he meant by this. The boat reminds me of Soma, the moon, that you see Isis and the Virgin Mary with a moon like that. Or for that matter, you see Shiva with a moon like that, symbolizing Soma or intoxication. And Beuys was a real Hermeticist, and that's why I'm putting him here towards the end of this lecture. He's the modern inheritor of this entire tradition in a very serious way, not in a half-assed way at all. He was a card-carrying member of the Anthroposophists and the Rosicrucians, which I only learned recently about the Rosicrucians. And I believe that everything Beuys did was a conscious work of magic. It wasn't just art. It wasn't just art, if you'll pardon me for saying that. It was art that was meant to change social reality. You know, his idea of social sculpture. I mean, it's conceivable that not every sketch and every little jeu d'esprit that Beuys carried out, because he was an immensely fecund artist, not every single thing, but certainly all the major actions and the major sculptural groups, I think, are deliberate Hermetic works aimed at changing consciousness of large numbers of people so that society itself will move towards his anarchist ideal, which he inherited from Rudolf Steiner. The Steinerians don't like to tell you this, but Steiner himself went through a big anarchist period. At the same time as he was involved in Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry, he was also deeply involved in anarchism. And Beuys resonated with those early political ideas of Steiner. And again, in this piece, in which he is indulging his fascination with Celtic themes, presumably he's being even more magical and mystical than usual. I'm unable to find a very complete description of this action, so I'm not by any means going to attempt to analyze it for you. I just draw your attention to Beuys, and next time you look at Beuys, remember this little talk I gave, and try to think of him, try to imagine him, although the forms are so surprisingly different, so utterly different than anything we've looked at here tonight. The intention, I believe, is absolutely the same. Well, the last piece I want you to look at is unique in that it's not from the West now, it's from Persia. And it's not any of the genres of art that we've been looking at. It's a rug. It's a woven rug. I did a book years ago with a friend of mine who devoted 20 years to collecting Persian rugs with pictures on them instead of geometric designs. There were only 2 people in Iran who were collecting rugs of that sort. They both had a lot of money, and whenever a dealer got hold of one, you'd call them both up and get them bidding against each other. But my friend Carl put together a magnificent collection, and we did a book together on it. Now this rug is probably early 20th century. And what you see here at the top is a line of poetry. I also chose this rug because it's a perfect emblem. It has both caption and image. The poem says, "The tree has broken out in buds. The nightingales are drunk. The whole world is suffused in pleasure. Friends sit together in joy. That's by the great Persian poet Saadi. And actually, although the rug is not signed, we don't know who the artist of the rug was, but the calligraphy is signed by, not that it matters, but Mirza Ali Akbar Naqash. Mirza the artist, it means. And the calligraphy is actually very, very fine. For a woven rug, you won't see finer calligraphy than that. Then in the border, you have all sorts of animals from the bestiaries. And in the middle, we have trees. Can you see that the buds are actually